The tension inside the packed courtroom was suffocating. The air crackled with the weight of unspoken truths, the kind that could destroy careers, unravel legacies, and send shockwaves through the highest echelons of power. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, sharp, unyielding, and unfazed by the storm brewing before her. Across the room, Judge Stephen Adams sat high on his bench, his expression an unreadable mask of disdain. What should have been a straightforward hearing on government ethics had already descended into a battlefield. But Bondi had come prepared. What neither Adams nor the courtroom knew was that she held a card so devastating it could bring the entire house down. It all started with a single document, one buried deep within the archives of a closed investigation into government contracts. A whistleblower, too afraid to go public, had slipped it to Bondi's team weeks earlier. On the surface, it was a procurement report detailing the awarding of a multi-million-dollar contract for infrastructure development, but hidden within the fine print was something much more damning. A direct connection between high-ranking officials and an undisclosed offshore account. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was a blatant conspiracy, one that could implicate figures at the very top of the political food chain. And at the heart of it, sitting in judgment over this case, was Stephen Adams. Bondi had expected resistance. What she hadn't anticipated was the level of hostility coming from the bench itself. From the moment proceedings began, Adams had made it clear he wasn't just a neutral arbitrator, he was an adversary. He scoffed at her evidence, interrupted her arguments with condescending remarks, and dismissed every line of questioning that ventured too close to uncomfortable truths. The defense, representing the government agency under investigation, barely needed to mount a counterargument. Adams was doing their work for them. His rulings, his tone, even his body language, it all signaled that this wasn't a fair trial. This was a farce, orchestrated to bury the case before it could take root. But Bondi wasn't easily rattled. She met Adams' glares with steady, unblinking resolve. Every insult, every blatant attempt to derail her case, she absorbed without reaction, knowing that patience was her greatest weapon. She continued her line of questioning, forcing the defense to answer, making them squirm under the weight of inconvenient facts. And then something changed. As Bondi laid out her next piece of evidence, a financial paper trail connecting a shell company to a sitting senator, Adams leaned forward. His knuckles turned white against the bench as he cut her off mid-sentence, voice tight with irritation. The objection was immediate, but it wasn't coming from the defense. It was the judge himself, slamming the gavel down with a force that echoed through the chamber. His reasoning was vague, his justification flimsy. The only clear takeaway was that he wanted this line of inquiry shut down. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't just Bondi who noticed. Reporters, legal analysts, even the spectators sensed it. The judge wasn't just presiding over the case, he was protecting someone. Bondi's eyes flickered toward the defense team. They had stopped taking notes, their attention solely fixed on Adams. Even they looked uncertain, as if realizing for the first time that their biggest advantage might also be their biggest liability. The judge pressed on, his irritation boiling, over into something more dangerous. His rebukes became personal. He called Bondi's case reckless, her evidence circumstantial. He ridiculed her legal strategy, questioned her credibility, implied she was chasing ghosts. Still, she held firm, because she knew something Adams didn't. Her team had uncovered a piece of evidence so damning, so irrefutable, that it wouldn't just shift the case. It would destroy him. A recording, a voice, his voice, making promises that should never have been made. Bondi had been waiting for the perfect moment to reveal it, and Adams, with his erratic behavior, was giving her everything she needed. For now she let him speak. Let him dig himself deeper. Let him believe he still controlled the room, because when she finally played that recording, The entire courtroom would see what she already knew. Judge Stephen Adams wasn't just ruling. On this case, he was part of it, and his downfall was about to begin. Bondi could feel the shift in the room, subtle but unmistakable. Adams had overplayed his hand. His bias, once masked beneath a thin veil of judicial authority, was now blatant, undeniable. Reporters exchanged knowing glances, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. Spectators murmured in hushed tones. Even the defense team sat rigid, realizing that their so-called advantage was spiraling into a liability. Still, Adams pushed forward, doubling down. His voice, once measured and authoritative, carried an edge of desperation. He accused Bondi of grandstanding, of using the courtroom for political theater. He waved off the financial records she had presented, scoffing at the suggestion that they proved anything at all. But Bondi wasn't biting. She let him fume, let him sneer, let him believe he was still in control. Then she calmly placed a new piece of evidence on the table, a document, one that hadn't been introduced yet. The room tensed as she slid it forward, her eyes locked on Adams. She didn't need to say anything. The judge hesitated. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in his expression, an instinctive wariness, a second of hesitation. It was small, barely perceptible, but Bondi caught it. And so did everyone else. She let the silence hang. Then she began. She spoke slowly, deliberately, outlining a new connection, one that hadn't been discussed before. The shell company she had exposed wasn't just tied to the senator. It had another recipient, a name that appeared again and again, tucked into legal fees, consulting contracts, buried in offshore transactions. The name? Stephen Adams. A ripple of shock shot through the room. The defense attorneys exchanged nervous glances, shifting in their seats. The gallery erupted into low whispers, disbelief spreading like wildfire. The once dismissive reporters sat upright, their attention locked onto Bondi as they frantically typed, capturing every word. Adams's reaction was immediate. His gavel slammed against the bench with thunderous force. His face, a rigid mask of fury, barely concealed the panic flickering. Beneath, his voice, strained and sharp, boomed across the room, calling for order. Bondi didn't flinch. She met his glare with an icy calm, her hands resting atop her notes as though she had all the time in the world. She didn't need to speak over him. She didn't need to match his anger. The weight of her evidence was speaking for her. But Adams wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his fingers gripping the bench. His accusations turned personal. He painted Bondi as a glory seeker, as a prosecutor desperate for attention, as someone who thrived on tearing good men down. The words were sharp, but they lacked their usual sting, because for the first time everyone in the room knew exactly what was happening. The judge was running scared. Still, he tried to wield his authority like a weapon, declaring the line of inquiry irrelevant, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial, warning Bondi that she was dangerously close to contempt. Bondi let him rant. Then she reached for her final move. She pulled out a small device and set it on the table, a recording device. A single button blinked red. Adams went still. The room followed. Bondi tilted her head slightly, her voice steady, as she announced that she had obtained audio evidence, direct confirmation of a conversation between Adams and an unnamed government official. A conversation that would confirm what everyone in the room already suspected. The judge exhaled sharply, his face ashen. Bondi gave him a moment, just enough time to let the realization sink in. Then she pressed play. The recording crackled to life. At first, just static. Then voices, muffled but clear enough. One belonged to Adams, the other a senior political figure. Their words were unmistakable. A deal. A carefully orchestrated scheme to bury an ethics investigation in exchange for judicial favors. A conversation so damning, so irrefutable, that it didn't just prove Adams's bias, it proved his guilt. The courtroom was deathly silent. Adams sat frozen, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape. He opened his mouth as if to object, but no words came. Then came the sound of movement, footsteps. From the back of the courtroom, officers in uniform stepped forward, their expressions grim. The tension snapped as they approached the bench, their presence an unspoken declaration of what was about to happen. A realization dawned across Adams's face. His control, his power, it was gone. One of the officers reached for their cuffs. Adams shot to his feet, his voice a raw mix of anger and panic as he shouted objections, demanding the trial be shut down, claiming the evidence was illegal, a setup, a lie. But no one was listening. Bondi sat still, her expression unwavering, as she watched Adams crumble beneath the weight of his own corruption. The gavel in his hand shook slightly. Then, as if realizing the inevitable, Adams turned to Bondi one last time. For the first time, there was no condescension, no smugness, only fear. The officers stepped in. A hush fell over the room. The cuffs locked around his wrists. A once powerful judge was led away in disgrace, his final act not as an arbiter of justice, but as its latest casualty. And Bondi? She turned back to the stunned courtroom, her voice steady as she uttered the words that would change everything. The case wasn't over. It was just beginning. The courtroom was still reeling. Adams was gone, dragged from the bench in a spectacle no one would soon forget, but his absence left a gaping void, an eerie silence that pressed down on the room like a suffocating weight. Reporters scribbled furiously, already crafting their headlines. Spectators exchanged stunned glances. The defense team sat in rigid silence, their expressions unreadable. The judge, their greatest shield, had crumbled before their eyes, and without him the walls were closing in fast. Bondi exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This was far from the victory some might assume. If anything, Adams's removal had only exposed the true depth of the corruption she was up against. He had been powerful, yes, but he wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn, a willing participant in something far more insidious. She turned back toward the prosecution table, her hands resting lightly on the documents before her. The next steps were already forming in her mind, but she wouldn't have long to plan. The defense, despite their apparent shock, wasn't going to sit idle. She could see it in their eyes, the flicker of calculation, the frantic adjustments as they processed what had just happened. They would regroup. They would strike back, and when they did, they would be ruthless. One of the defense attorneys, a sharp-eyed man with a polished demeanor, cleared his throat and stood. His voice, when he spoke, carried the controlled precision of someone attempting to steer a sinking ship back on course. He called for an immediate dismissal of the case, arguing that with Adams removed, the trial was now compromised beyond repair. Bondi expected this. She was already shaking her head before the words had even finished leaving his mouth. She pushed back her chair, standing with deliberate calm. The courtroom wasn't under Adams's control anymore, and she wasn't about to let his removal be used as an excuse to bury the case. She turned her attention to the interim judge, an older, no-nonsense woman who had stepped in during the chaos. Her expression was unreadable, but her reputation was well known. She wasn't easily intimidated. Bondi began her argument. She spoke not of Adams, but of the case itself, the government contracts, the offshore accounts, the funneling of taxpayer money into hidden hands. She painted a picture so vivid, so impossible to ignore, that the courtroom seemed to shrink around her words. She outlined the growing paper trail, the suspicious transactions, the pattern of behavior that stretched far beyond a single corrupt judge, because now she had more than just evidence. She had momentum. The defense pushed back hard. They dismissed. The evidence as circumstantial claimed the removal of Adams invalidated the proceedings, accused Bondi of pursuing a vendetta rather than justice. Their voices grew louder, their arguments more aggressive, but it only made them look desperate. The judge considered both sides carefully. Then, in a firm, measured tone, she denied the motion to dismiss. The trial would continue. A fresh wave of tension rippled through the room. The defense attorneys exchanged wary glances, forced to acknowledge that they had just lost a crucial battle. They weren't in control anymore. Bondi, however, barely reacted. There was no satisfaction in this. She knew what was coming. Retaliation. She could already feel it looming, waiting in the shadows. Corruption at this level didn't go quietly. The people who had orchestrated this, the real architects behind Adams' betrayal, wouldn't let her keep pulling at the threads without consequence, and she was right. That night, as she prepared her next round of evidence, an unexpected message arrived at her office. An unmarked envelope slipped beneath the door. No name, no return address. Inside, a single piece of paper, a warning. One sentence, printed in cold, unfeeling text. Stop digging. Bondi's pulse slowed, not from fear, but from certainty. She had struck a nerve. She studied the paper, her mind already, working through the possibilities. This wasn't a bluff. Whoever sent it wasn't just trying to intimidate her. They were making a promise. If she kept pushing, the consequences would escalate. But that only meant one thing. She was closer than she realized. She turned to her desk, rifling through the stacks of documents, looking for the next move. There was a connection she hadn't fully explored yet, one that linked Adams to a broader network of judicial interference. His corruption hadn't existed in a vacuum. There were others, and she had a name, a high-ranking official, a man who had, up until now, remained just outside the periphery of the case. A senator, a man whose voice had been on the recording, a man who had just announced his bid for re-election. Bondi exhaled sharply. She had no doubt that this was who the warning had come from, or at the very least, who it was meant to protect. She glanced back at the paper in her hand, then slowly, methodically, set it down. She wasn't stopping. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. But as she turned back to her notes, a nagging thought settled in the back of her mind. The people she was up against had already sacrificed a judge to protect themselves. What would they be willing to do next? The stakes had just been raised, and Bondi was about to find out how far they would go to stop her. The warning had been clear, but it didn't rattle her. It confirmed she was on the right path. The people she was after were afraid, and when corrupt men felt fear, they got sloppy. That was her advantage. She arrived at the courthouse the next morning under heavy watch, the media still circling like vultures in the aftermath of Adams's arrest. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but she didn't break stride. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. The defense attorneys had abandoned their earlier composure. Their smiles were forced, their postures stiff. They knew this. It wasn't just about saving a client anymore. This was survival. The judge wasted no time. The proceedings resumed, but Bondi barely had a moment to settle before the first strike landed. The defense made a bold move, an emergency motion to suppress the recording that had brought Adams down. Their argument was flimsy, hinging on claims of entrapment and privacy violations, but it wasn't the legal maneuver that caught Bondi's attention. It was the confidence. They knew something she didn't. She sat still, listening as they argued, as their voices grew stronger, bolder. Then the moment came, the reveal. A new piece of evidence. Bondi's name was on it, a supposed document, proof that she had known about the recording long before the trial, that she had used illegal means to obtain it. A fabricated chain of events, carefully constructed to make her look like the corrupt one. She barely blinked. Of course, they'd come for her next. That was the only move they had left. The courtroom tensed, waiting for her reaction, but she gave them none. Instead, she calmly requested to examine the document. The judge granted it. She took her time, too much time, letting the weight of the moment stretch, letting the defense believe, just for a second, that they had her. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady, unimpressed. She pointed out inconsistencies in the document's timestamps, errors in formatting, tiny mistakes that revealed what it really was. A forgery! She laid it all out, methodically, exposing every flaw. The defense's confidence shattered in real time, their faces betraying the realization that their last-ditch effort was unraveling. Then she turned to the judge. This wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attempt to obstruct justice. She requested an immediate forensic investigation into the document's origins. The judge granted it. A slow, deadly ripple spread across the defense team. One by one, they realized the full weight of what had just happened. The trap they had set had sprung on them. Bondi leaned back, hands clasped in front of her. She had turned their own desperation into another weapon. Now, not only was their case crumbling, but they had just implicated themselves in evidence tampering. But she wasn't done. She shifted gears, steering the focus back to the real target, the senator. She laid out her newest findings, the ones she had been piecing together since Adams fell, the financial transactions leading back to a political action committee, the missing funds, the forged expense reports. She painted a picture so clear that the room itself seemed to constrict under its weight. The defense scrambled, trying to object, to discredit her, but the damage had already been done. Then came the final blow, another recording, a second piece of audio, this time leaked from an anonymous source. She played it, the senator's voice, not just discussing bribes and judicial manipulation, issuing orders, a direct command to shut Bondi down by any means necessary. Gasps spread through the courtroom. A storm of murmurs erupted in the gallery. The defense attorneys looked physically ill. The judge didn't hesitate. She ordered an immediate subpoena for the senator's financial records and campaign contributions. The walls were closing in, but Bondi knew she wasn't safe yet. Because the people she was after weren't just politicians, they were power, and power didn't go down without a fight. That night she left the courthouse under guard. She didn't go home. It wasn't safe. Instead, she went to an undisclosed location, somewhere quiet, somewhere secure. And yet she wasn't surprised when she found the second note waiting for her. This one wasn't slipped under a door. It wasn't an anonymous message. It was printed on official letterhead. From the senator himself. You don't know who you're dealing with. Bondi read the words once, then twice. Then she picked up the phone. It was time to make a move they wouldn't expect, because they thought they were untouchable. She was about to prove them wrong. Pam Bondi held the senator's note in her hands, feeling the weight of what it represented. This wasn't just a threat. It was arrogance, a final, desperate attempt to intimidate her into silence. But intimidation had never worked on her before, and it certainly wasn't going to work now. The next morning, she didn't just return. To the courthouse, she walked in like a woman who had already won. The reporters, the flashing cameras, the whispered speculations, none of it mattered. She had what she needed. And today, the world was going to see the full extent of the corruption she had been fighting to expose. Inside the courtroom, the energy was different. The defense attorneys were tense, hollow-eyed from a long night of damage control. The senator wasn't there, but his absence spoke volumes. He was hiding behind his legal team, his power slipping through his fingers with every passing second. Bondi wasted no time. She presented her final round of evidence with the same steady, methodical precision that had gotten her this far. This time, the picture wasn't just damning, it was inescapable. Wire transfers, anonymous accounts, coded messages between Adams and high-ranking officials. And then, the final piece, an official transcript of a phone call between the senator and a corporate executive. A conversation about diverting government funds, a conversation about keeping friendly judges in place, a conversation about silencing her. The words were clear, unmistakable. The senator had orchestrated everything, the bribery, the judicial interference, even the attempt to frame her. The courtroom was dead silent. The defense had no objections left, no counterarguments. The truth was too big to spin. Then the doors swung open. Federal agents. The room shifted, tension tightening like a noose as they approached the defense table. The lead attorney barely had time to react before one of the agents spoke. The senator was under arrest. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the reality of what was happening sank in. Bondi watched as the defense team scrambled, phones out, whispers frantic, but there was nothing they could do. The house of cards had collapsed. One by one, names were listed. Indictments followed. More officials, more judges exposed. The corruption ran deep, but now it was unraveling in real time. By the time Bondi stepped outside, the world was already watching. Cameras, journalists, everyone scrambling to cover the fallout. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was a reckoning. Justice had won, and no threat, no warning, no corrupt politician had been able to stop it. The fight was over, and Bondi had won.